Hi guys, Phil Good back here again. This is a continuation of chapter one of my book. I did the first video, and the name of the book is Ignited by the Bottle, Delivered by the Fist. And this video is a continuation of chapter one, which is entitled First Blood. Okay, and towards the end of the last video, I spoke about, the episode of me being knocked out of my high chair at 11 months of age, and went flying across the kitchen and dining room floor, ending up at my 18-year-old auntie's feet. Okay, so obviously, 11 months of age, I didn't remember that story, but that story was told to my brother. I've got three brothers, younger brothers. I'm the eldest of six kids, three younger brothers, and two much younger sisters. But the episode of me being knocked out of my high chair was told by my auntie to my third brother down Milton, when he probably would have been he's obviously 3 years younger than me. So, he would have been rather probably late 40s. I would have been 50 odd, maybe a little older. And, because my auntie told my brother, didn't tell me, but it must have been the guilt, must have been getting to her over the years, keeping it locked in to herself and that, and not letting anybody know about it, and so on, except obviously her husband. But anyway, she told the whole story to my brother Milton, and of course he relayed it to me. And so that's how I got to know about the episode of me being knocked out of my high chair at 11 months of age. But it was an interesting thing, about my father, and sort of going back a bit, and his relationship with my mother, her parents and stuff. My father used to drink a lot, and a lot of the problems that my parents had, and the anger that my father had, the extra anger he had, and it was obviously inflamed further with alcohol. And he was pretty much an alcoholic, he couldn't give his grog, his beer, his spirits up, and that sort of thing. So, given his state of mind, the drinking alcohol would just make him a whole lot worse. But the thing that he hated my mother's parents for, my grandparents on that side, was that he met my mother when she was 16 years of age. She was working in a shoe shop down in a place called Highbury in Birkenhead in Auckland. And my father was 21, my mother was 16. And so that's when he started courting her and so on. And but he had a reputation around the area of being a boozer and a brawler, like a pub fighter. For example, there's one story about my uncle, my father's brother, 4 or 5 years younger than my father, actually. And they're in a pub in a place called Northcote in Auckland, on the North Shore. And they're drinking in the pub, and my uncle was there as well, and he's sitting at a different table. And anyway, this guy was hassling my uncle at the pub, and my father was sort of looking on from a distance, and this guy that was heckling my uncle was over 6 foot, apparently. And my father was only about 5'7", but really solid and nuggety, and of course in his prime then. And so when this guy started heckling my uncle, my father just walked over there and went bang and knocked this guy clean out with one hit. Yeah. And then, of course, they threw him out of the pub. So that's what my father was reputation. And my grandparents, on my mother's side, my mother's parents obviously knew this from around the area. He was a boozer and a brawler. So, of course, they didn't want my mother marrying him, right? For obvious reasons. They were religious. and so on as well. They were Methodist and religious, and of course the last thing that they wanted was their eldest daughter to marry Jack, with his reputation of being a boozer and a brawler, because, and so they didn't allow. My father wanted to marry my mother before she got to the age of 21, 21 being the age where it didn't need parent consent to marry, right? So my grandparents didn't allow my father to marry my mother, and so it was fast forward 16 to 21, and that's when they got married. When mother was the ripe old age of 21 and didn't have to ask anybody for permission to marry whoever he liked. So that's one of the reasons why my father hated my grandparents for, and so on. And of course, the religious aspect, like my grandfather on my father's side, and that side of the family, they weren't religious. I consider my grandfather good on my dad's side to be a very, very spiritual person. Spiritual from the point of view of being kind, gentle, loving, incredibly generous, and that type of person. Totally unselfish. Whereas my father was a very, very selfish person. And I couldn't understand how he could have been his father's son, because they were so, so different. And but anyway, that caused a lot of issues and problems, a lot of arguments and fights in our family when it came up to talking about, families. And because my father considered, he thought that my mother's parents thought that they were better than his side of the family, and all the rest of it. They were religious, his side wasn't, and all that sort of thing that fueled and inflamed and caused a lot of arguments. And of course, the other argument that my mother and arguments that they always had was about money, right? And my mother in particular not having enough housekeeping money she used for buying food, clothing, shoes, net for us kids, and so on. And she was very, very fortunate, my mother, in that my grandfather, my dad's father, lived with us until I was 11, being the eldest. He died when I was 11 in 1964. But he was a man, very, very, very wealthy man for those times. He owned a block of land, subdivided those sections up, and so on. Had a carrying business, had a share in what they call a depot, a place in this is on the city side of Auckland Harbour, and he had a depot there, which meant that they got cargo from the wharves off ships and then stored them in the depot, and then literally carted them out to wherever they're going to, their destination. So therefore, my father, like I think I touched on it earlier, but so he was very, very, very fortunate, and so were his brother. Well, so was his brother and his sisters. Like Grandpa Good gave them a lot of money, set my father up with his own freehold home, built it, freehold home, given a section to him, bought a brand new car off the floor. No hire purchase, no mortgage. So therefore, and of course, my mother obviously knew this because she was living in the same house, and Grandpa was living with us. So, but the old man used to love going down to the pub and shouting his mates grog and beer and all the rest of it, and having a hullabaloo time and stuff, spending a lot of time down there, away from the family, away from my mother, away from us kids. And that was his favourite haunt, either the pub or the RSA. RSA, Returned Servicemen Association, Returned Servicemen's League in Australia here, and wherever else you like to call it, anywhere else in the world. But obviously it was to, my father loved being the centre of attention and great talker and shouting his mates. He was the best thing since life's bed, right? But not to us in the family. He was quite the opposite. But to all his mates and that, he was Jack. Oh, he's the best thing, like he was centre of attention. He loved that and so on. So everybody listening to Jack and what he had to say and so on, So but that's what a lot of arguments in the family caused through him holding back money so he could use it to shout his mates and spend it on grog and stuff, rather than sort of help out by giving mum more housekeeping money. So she was always scrimping and scraping and stuff like that. She didn't have a car to go and get groceries and things from the supermarket. She had to go down quite often because the old man would take the car to work, obviously, and leave her, on foot or go down to the supermarket by bus, and she'd be lugging huge amounts of groceries by hand up the hill from the bus to the house, and that was her lot in life. But she was helped in the respect that both my grandfathers and my grandmother on my mum's side, my grandpa Shaw on my mother's side, he worked he was a retired dairy farmer. He was a dairy farmer for a lot of years up until my mum and her two sisters went to high school, and then my nana on that side wanted her three girls, to go to high school and be in a more city environment, city schools rather than sort of rural schools. So Grandpa reluctantly sold the dairy farm and went to town, and but he got a job in a clerical position, doing the accounts and for companies that he actually worked for, and but back in those days, back in the days of pound, shillings, and pence, he was only getting paid £13 a week, which in those days was still a lot of money, right? Because he had a freehold home as well. Didn't know a dime on that, and he'd go to work in a suit, very very smart looking as well, and do his job. But at the end of the week, he'd earn £13 for the week. So my mum was very lucky that her mum was a very good bake, and both Nana and Grandpa, my mum's parents, knew how mum was really under the pump. She had 4 kids under 5, 4 boys under 5, and my 2 sisters came along much later. But 4 boys under 5, my mother never had any help from my father in terms of raising us boys. My mum was left on her own to do the whole thing herself. Look after us boys, do the shopping by herself, get the groceries, make all the beds, do the housework, and so on. She never had any help. Back in those days, of course, we used to have what you call a wringer washing machine to do the washing, and the washing would happen and finish in the tub of the washing machine, and then above it you'd have 2 rubber wheels, one going alternate ways, and you'd put your washing in between the two. The rollers would be going, and you'd feed a towel through or clothing through, and that's the way you'd sort of wring it out before you hung it out in the clothesline. But Mother used to have to do everything herself, every single thing. No, my father never ever helped Mum at all. Back in the days, there were no dishwashers, right? All the dishes were washed by hand. So with us 4 boys and the old man, and of course Grandpa Good, my dad's father, was living with us for those 11 years until he passed away. And so Mum did everything. No help from my father at all. He'd either come home from work, disappear down to the pub after he had a meal, or he'd just sit back and watch television and didn't help Mum. She'd just be ploughing away, washing the dishes, wiping them, or with a tea towel and so on. And that was her lot in life. And but my mother was helped in that my Grandpa Good, he like I said, my dad's father, he would get director's fees from the company that he was a 25% shareholder in, which was the depot or the facility that held all the goods from the ships, and then to be transported out. So he had a 25% share in that. So he'd get director's fees from that company come through each month. So most of it he would give to my father, and my father did nothing with it other than go down to the pub and shout all his mates grog and stuff, money that wasn't his, just given to him by my grandfather. But my grandfather was smart enough to hold a little bit back, and he would give some money, a few pounds, to whatever my mum needed to balance the household budget. But he was always give it to my mother and say, Ruth, never let Jack know that I'm giving you this money, right? I'm just giving it to you under the table. Just keep it quiet. And at the end of each week, my nana and grandpa, my mum's parents, would come, because my grandpa, being a retired dairy farmer, he bought two sections, 2 quarter-acre sections. One he'd build a house on, and the other quarter-acre he'd grow vegetables on. So that was he wasn't dairy farming anymore, but he got his hands in the dirt and growing vegetables and things like that. And now he used to grow lots of flowers and around the house and so on. But Grandpa used to have an orchard. He'd have a huge big vegetable garden. He'd give away vegetables to all his 3 girls for their families and to other people around the area as well. And quite often they would store, any surplus vegetables grown, they would store them and bottle them and things like that, or string up onions and put them under the house and then dry them so they have onions available right through the winter. And also vegetables or fruit that would be bottled, so preserved, in other words. So anyway, my nana and grandpa, my mum's parents, would come along at the end of each week on a Friday, and grandpa, like I said before, only had 13 pounds for the week in his position, but he'd always give 1 pound to mum, and my nana, who would have been spending a few days baking cakes and little buns and things like that, and she'd bring them to my mother to help, a couple of tins full of cakes and bickies and that she would make, and that would help my mother out, because my grandmother knew that she was under the pub, And Grandpa, of course, not only would give her a pound, but he'd bring a whole lot of fresh vegetables, which would keep my mother going for the week, right? So that all these sort of things, my 2 grandfathers and my nana on my mum's side, helped my mother balance the budget. And see, both grandfathers and my nana on my mum's side were lovely people. They were very, very generous people, and they cared so much for my mum and her situation. But my father couldn't care less. My father was a very, very selfish person. He was all about him. He didn't give 2 hoots about my mother and all the workload she had. Didn't care about the money that she had. £5 a week for years, even though prices of food, prices of clothing and shoes had gone up. But he kept giving her the same £5 a week for years. So that was my mother's lot. It was really hard going and caused a lot of arguments, a lot of stress, and but it was really great. I could see the contrast, the comparison between my father being so selfish and my 2 grandfathers and my grandmother being so generous, totally the opposite. So that's why I find it difficult to find out, to understand why my father was so selfish. He had his own father as a role model, was quite the opposite, very, very generous, a giving person, a kind person, a loving person. Yet my father wasn't. I didn't know my grandmother, my dad's father, because she had a heart attack and died when she was 50, well before I was born. So there was obviously issues there between my grandmother. That's where our Maori blood from New Zealand came down through that line to my father, and so on. So not that was saying, it was just that's what it was in our family, But obviously, my grandmother, my dad's father, did have a short fuse, allegedly, because I didn't know her at all, but allegedly. And my father used to go running to my grandfather, his father, for protection against his own mum. So So if Dad had issues there that were left, they were never addressed, and that caused obviously a lot of problems, and probably added fuel to the fire of why my father drank alcohol and tried to blot things out, and that it happened, what things that happened as a kid, and obviously he never forgave himself or his mother and so on. So he was a very, very angry man, and the alcohol just made it a whole lot worse. So, right, guys, I think I'll just leave it here. I could go on and on as you probably are hearing, but I'll just finish it here and I'll continue it on. Okay. Okay. Love you guys. Hope you're having a great day. Bye for now.